Conversations. This is our second episode, and with us tonight we've got Darin Simms, is the author of this book right here, Jesus versus Superheroes: A Clash of Ideas. And so we're going to talk with Darin a little bit about his book, about the themes in it, and hopefully shed a little bit of light on his concepts of the spirituality in comics and superheroes, that sort of thing. So anyway, I'll just go ahead and tell you right off the bat how I know Darin. I used to be a worship leader. I'm a pastor now, but I used to be a worship leader at the Real Life Community of Faith of Morristown, Ohio. And Darin was one of the pastors there that originally got a hold of me and asked me if I'd be interested in helping them do this new church start. And so that's how we know each other. He was the pastor there, and I was the worship leader. And over the years, he moved away to Indiana. Are you still in Indiana?
No, I'm living in Kingston, Ohio now, just south
Oh,
of
okay, so
south of Circleville.
okay, so back in Ohio then.
Yeah,
Circleville, well, that's your old stomping grounds, isn't it?
it is.
Okay, so you literally came back home.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great. I did the same thing. I moved back to Washington County, Ohio, where I'm originally from.
Right.
But anyway, Darin moved away and moved on to another ministry, and I did the same thing eventually. And now I am in Washington County, Ohio, and I'm a pastor, and I still do these live streams as well and other various content on the internet and on YouTube. So anyway, when I found out Darin was going ahead and writing this book, I was one of the people that helped to fundraise the crowdfunding for it, and I was grateful in the acknowledgement sections. I got my name printed in a book, so that's kind of cool to see my name printed inside a book. But thank you. But very interesting idea for me, the idea of the spirituality in comic books. And so, Darin, if you would, before we get into that. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you've been doing lately, and how your family is, and all that kind of stuff.
Fantastic.
For those that are watching that are from that know you personally, kind of give them an update personally on your family as well too.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm living in a small town called Kingston, Ohio, just south of Circleville, and currently not in ministry. Looking to actually start another church in Pickaway County. So if there's anybody from Pickaway County that's looking for a church to get started in, let me know. Especially if you're a worship leader, I could use a good one. So um, we spent 15 years out at the last church that I was in Indiana. And it was a very good 15 years. Took over a church that was 150 years old when I got there. We had some fun ministry there and did some really unique and fun things. But a couple of years after COVID, so I wrote the book in 2019. It was printed in January of 2020, which made it really difficult then because COVID kind of shut everything down in March of 2020. So didn't get to do a lot of the promotion that we had planned for the first year of the book. So one of the things that we know about the COVID was with the whole COVID situation is that something called the Great Resignation, where people had to decide, is this what I want to do with my life? And after 15 years of ministry at that church, at that point it was 13 years of ministry. I had to decide in 2020 that not really what I wanted to do. I was teaching school full time. I got my provisional teaching license in Indiana, so I was teaching school full time, pastoring full time, and with 5 kids at that point, all of them were out of the house. I had 2 grandkids at the time, and here in the next 2 months, I will be up to 6 grandkids. So life just continues to move forward for us. But it was just one of those. I was part of that Great Resignation. I called my bishop and said, "Hey, listen, I need to look to transition out. So if you can find me a spot, that's great. And if not, I will find something else." And so that's what happened. The bishop could not find me a spot, so at least not a spot that was full time, and not a spot that was in an area that would have worked for me. So we decided to move back home, and that's what we did. And so I live about 20 minutes from my mom, 30 minutes from Lori's mom, and So things are good. Hannah's. So let me start with the top. For those of you that know me, my oldest son is Josiah. Josiah lives in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. He's doing really well over there. He and his wife, they're expecting their second child July the 5th. So that'll be kind of fun. Bethany just had her first baby back in March, and so they're living in Westerville, Ohio, and that's a really good thing. She and her husband Joe are fantastic, and Joe's a drummer, so I love having more musicians in the family. Uh, so then we have uh, Abigail, who still lives in Indiana. She's married with 2 kids, very much part of the rural culture. Her oldest daughter, Aubrey, is 13 and she likes to show and race horses. So she's very active in the barrel racing and flag racing with horses, very good. So we enjoy doing that, getting a chance to see her with that. But Abigail has 2 kids, and she and her husband are still in Napanee, Indiana. So if anybody has an RV, he may have helped work on your RVs, because just about 95% of all RVs in the U.S. are made in Elkhart County, which is where Napanee is. So that's the county is known for RVs. They are the RV capital. Hannah is living in Lakeland, Florida. She's an English school teacher. She had went to school at Rollins College in Florida, then went on to get her master's degree in Scotland at Edinburgh University, and so she is now teaching high school down in Lakeland, Florida. She lives in, so that's where she's at. Hannah's not married. Noah is living in Asheville, Ohio, and he has a 1-year-old son. So that's kind of the update on my family and kind of where we're at with everything. Lori is working at a local hospital here in town, running their volunteer services department. So she's the manager of all volunteer services, and is really enjoying that work. So that's my update.
Okay. So obviously you have background in new church starts. That's how we met, and
Yeah.
now you're considering doing something along those lines again. How did you get involved in new church starts? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that was something that happened when I was still in college. I went to Huntington University in Huntington, Indiana, and really where I felt called to ministry back when I was in high school. When I got to Huntington University, as God was working in me, trying to help me to see where I best fit in, I realized that I didn't really fit in with traditional churches. I think a little differently, a little bit outside the box. And so the idea of starting new churches that had less tradition about them and allowed people to be a little bit more real, which is one of the things I really liked about real life when we were there. I mean, we were just real people trying to do life together, and that was one of the things that made that so good. So really loved doing that. Helped plant a church in Reynoldsburg, Ohio called First Love. Went from there to plant a church called Eagles Wings in Pickerington Bryce area, on the east side of Columbus. And then it was after that we ended up, out at Morristown doing the real life thing. And so it just has been a part of who I am, and understanding of uh, spirituality can't be based in. Uh, from my perspective, Christianity has a long history, but that doesn't mean we have to stay, 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago. Things have changed since then. Culture has changed. We don't live in the same country that Christianity started. We don't share many of the same values of the world that was there. And so there were so many things that have changed. And I just felt that churches, especially a lot of Protestant churches, just got stuck in a routine where they didn't think through what they were thinking or doing, and they only just repeated what previous generations had done. So by the time I got into church planting, early 2000s, churches were still being. It was you. If you walked into most churches, you would have thought you were still in the 70s. And so they thought like people did in the 70s. But you know, if you lived in the 2000s were nothing like the 70s. And so the
Right.
only way to reach a group of people is by speaking their language. And that's kind of what brought me to the Jesus versus superheroes, you know, with the real explosion of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Um, it was something I grew up reading comics, so I was familiar with all of the heroes. But when it really gained, you know, that pop culture phenomenon, there had to be a tie between what the world was seeing everywhere else and what culture was talking about, and spirituality and what Jesus had to say. And so I kind of got this idea to begin to teach about the similarities between uh, comic characters and the teachings in the Bible. You know, because every comic character has a personality, and depending on who's writing the story, because writers don't stay with books, you know, indefinitely. They're usually short run. By short run, you know, 4, 5, 6 years, and then they're moving on to the next. Especially since, you know, Stan Lee gave up a lot of control of that, then things just began to really, artists and writers didn't stay forever on a book. So beginning to understand how to communicate, why is, like, Superman's not in this book. My book, Jesus versus superheroes, is all about Marvel superheroes. um, DC Comics, you know, when you begin to think of those, Superman is in essence a Messiah story. The
Hmm.
creators of Superman were Jewish. And so for them, Superman became a Messiah story sent from another world with great power to rescue humanity, to lift them up from their sin, to rid the world of evil. And it was specifically Americanized. You know, for it was a battle for
Right.
truth, justice, in the American way. So you begin to see, and that was a long time ago. So in that long history of comics, you begin to realize, okay, so there's that thread. Many of the, you know, Stan Lee was Jewish. His real name was, I think, Lieberman, and he changed it to Lee, so that so he wouldn't be associated only with Jews, especially during the war. And so he had that religious background in him. And so when you begin to read what he did, especially in the early 60s with comics, and bringing a different bend on comics, because with DC, other than Batman, you know, a lot of their heroes, well, Flash is also normal, but, you know, Wonder Woman was a goddess.
Hmm.
Um, Martian Manhunter is from Mars. They have a lot of heroes that come from elsewhere into this world. Uh, what Stan Lee did is he took an everyday person like Peter Parker and said, let's
Hmm.
make him a normal human being. What would a normal teenager, or maybe a high school or college age kid, what would happen if he suddenly found himself with superpowers, and what would that be like? And so that's where he kind of drafts the power. So in the book, I write a chapter on Spider-Man, because one of the great lines that Stan came up with in that story is, with great power comes great responsibility. And then you begin to think about, well, what did Jesus say about power? Because Jesus says a lot to his followers, or at least the Bible tells us that Jesus says a lot about the power that followers of Jesus should have. If we have power, isn't there a responsibility with that? And what does that look like? And so in that chapter on Spider-Man, we kind of talk about, I kind of write about what kind of responsibilities do we have. If we do have the power that Scripture says we have, what's our responsibility with that power? So if we have the power to forgive sin, what's our responsibility with that? Do we wield it on, you know, just forgiving every sin all the time, and never hold anybody, and there's never any accountability for sin? Or do we use that power just to forgive our own sins, so we do whatever we want and then forgive ourselves? Or do we try to focus that power to do the most good in the world? And so it's a real interesting way to think through some of those issues. In the chapter on the Incredible Hulk, um, the Hulk is really a human being who, you know, Dr. Bruce Banner has some issues with anger. And so when he gets hit by gamma rays, it kind of divides it's almost like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde story, right? So uh, he is a brilliant doctor, but the Hulk is an uncontrollable rage that he can't ever show as a human being. But once it's separated from him, it just blows up all over the place. And the Hulk is uncontrollable. And what's interesting about that is when we talk about what does the Bible say about how we should handle anger, and because what you have seen, I have seen, most people, if you're listening, you've seen people that when they get angry, they blow up and they do all kinds of damage, whether it's physical damage, when they're hitting you or hitting other people or breaking things. Uh, and then when they calm down, they come back to their human self and then they apologize for it. And that's kind of the story of Bruce Banner and the Hulk. Well, that's not the story of Jesus, right?
Right.
So when you begin to say, well, what would the Bible say about behaving like that? That it's not okay to blow up and hurt people and then just apologize for it, right? That's the Bible teaches something very different. And it's not that Marvel Comics was trying to say it was okay. Marvel Comics was just showing this is what happens. So in a world when you have uncontrollable strength, and just ungodly strength, really. I mean, the Hulk is the strongest character in the Marvel universe at the time that he's created there in the 60s. He can level cities, and there has to be consequence for that, right? When you do damage, when you hurt people, there's consequence for that. And just because you come back to your human self and say, man, I wish I hadn't done that, doesn't make it okay. And so we kind of talk about that in the chapter on the Incredible Hulk, and I think it's one of the things that make that really interesting, because now we have to look and say, well, how do I behave when I'm angry? Do I take it myself? Am I always putting myself down when I'm angry, telling me what a bad human being I am? Because that's not okay either. So, we don't have right to self-harm when we're angry any more than we have right to harm other people. And so for me, when we talk about, Marvel superheroes, we have this opportunity to really delve into what drives those characters and how does that reflect on us. And knowing the history of scripture and the historical teachings of Christianity, how does all of that fit in with that? And one of the things one of the chapters I really liked, but I think it was one of the most controversial in the book, was the chapter on Doctor Strange, where I talk about how Doctor Strange is a master of mysticism. He practices magic, and he has all kinds of abilities magically to change the world that he lives in, to prevent things from coming into the world that would bring harm, but also to warp the reality around him for his own benefit, or for what he perceives is a benefit for the greater good. Right. So then you have to deal with, okay, so he uses magical words and phrases to make these things come about. Well, when you think about what prayer is for the Christian, a lot of times we're looking at the Bible says that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but we wrestle against powers and principalities not of this world, right? So when we begin to say, okay, so when we're praying for something to happen, we're saying there are things out there that we have no control over. We need to say something for God to intervene on our behalf, to take control of these things that we have no control over. And so, in essence, just like Doctor Strange is saying magic words to tap into a power to fix his world, that's what we're doing with prayer. And so there's not a whole lot difference between saying an incantation and saying a prayer. I mean, they're different in this in how they're focused, but the idea is the same behind them, right? We're looking for something else of power the power that we don't have on our own to fix something that we can't fix. And so a lot of readers have commented on that's really hard for them to understand, because prayer isn't anything like magic, and yet almost all of us at the end of our prayers will say something like, in Jesus' name, right? Because we think that we have to have that phrase on the end of our prayer, because that's the key that unlocks the prayer.
It's the formula. Yeah.
Yes. formula. And I tell people it's your incantation, it's your magic word, your abracadabra. So as long as I say in Jesus' name, then I know God will do something.
And there are a lot of people that feel that way too. They believe that the formality, the structure is what it is, but really it's all about the intent beneath it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when I look at that and say, well, so how can we learn from this? How can we pull this together as Christians and say, well, what is it about Doctor Strange that's so fascinating? Why? I mean, his character, especially on the screen, just jumped out at you if you watched the movie. I thought that Benedict Cumberbatch did a great job of embodying that character. But realizing that there was a power out there that he didn't know about, and he couldn't control, but he could tap into it. And in essence, we're tapping into the power of God with our prayers, right? We can't control what God does with that power. We don't get to wield it. God doesn't give us, a magic cloak that will go and do our bidding for us. We simply say, God, we're going to put this in your hands. We can't fix it, but we want you to do something about it, and then wait for God to work on our behalf. And so for me, I just find, being able to say, yeah, I get that. I can understand what that is. And so when we begin to kind of work through some of the other things in the book, the other characters that have opportunities to change the world, and what do they do with that? Black Panther is one of them. So the story of Black Panther is that he's the king of a nation called Wakanda, and Wakanda is a cloaked nation that nobody knows about, and yet they have incredible wealth and incredible power and incredible intelligence that's within that nation. And the idea is, when you've got all of that available and you choose not to use it to benefit the world, are you doing? Is it wrong for you to hold that just for yourselves? So when you have the ability to do good and choose not to do it, to speak in Christian terms, is that sin? When you have the ability to help people and you choose not to help, is it sin? And so that really becomes an issue in the story of the Black Panther. And so, do you open up your nation, your wealth, your intelligence to people who might use it in ways that aren't good for the world, right? Because as soon as you open it up, other people can use it, but they may not have the same high morals as you have, and that's exactly what happens. And so it
Yeah,
happens in the movies. People use it for their own good rather than for the good of humanity, and
right.
that's
And
what. Go ahead.
in real world terminology, you could apply that to something like nuclear technology, like something that has its potential to be used for something great and also be misused. And think of artificial intelligence as the current thing
Right.
that there's so many abuses that have been happening, and so many more that could happen in the future, that we're all concerned about it, of course. But then, that, I don't know if you're familiar with Randy Travis and his story within recent weeks,
Yep.
how he was able to release the new project using the help of artificial intelligence to recreate his voice
Yeah.
that he was not able to do with his actual voice. And so it's just like any technology. The way I look at it is that it can be used for good or for evil. But I like how you tied the Black Panther story into the concept of with great power comes with great power comes great responsibility, which is of course is the Spider-Man thing.
Yeah.
And I find that as a common theme throughout a lot of comic book characters.
Yeah. And the question has to be, if you found yourself with great power, what would you do with it?
Right.
Then the question is, well, what do you consider great power? So when you kind of weigh out some of the superheroes, like the Hulk is incredibly powerful and Bruce Banner is incredibly smart, but especially in the early years of that book, the Hulk isn't smart,
Right.
and Bruce Banner isn't strong. So when you find yourself with great intelligence, what do you do with it? And Banner's developing weapons for the military, and the Hulk is destroying a world with his strength. So both of them are taking their great assets and using them for things that may not be particularly good. And so, later in the 80s and 90s, they begin to move the Hulk away from that, to try to fix some of that, because the writers are recognizing, man, these guys they're both bad.
Yeah.
They great things about them, but they're not doing great things. And so we have to decide,
Right.
followers of Christ, what do we do with that?
Right.
We sit on it like Wakanda did for generations? Do we use it for our own good, and do we pound the people with it like the Hulk would, and tell them that they're all going to hell because they deserve to? Or do we try to find ways to fine tune a gamma ray to create bombs, to fine tune our words, to let people know that if they don't do what we want, real harm will come to them? Which we know churches that manipulate and harm and use words to hurt. You have to really work. We know Christians that do that on a regular basis. You have to really work to say, okay, so what do I do with what I know? How do I work through some of the things that God has given me? And for me, um, I'm just a pop culture guy, and I love comics, and I love the stories, and I love writing, and I love the idea of thinking through these things. So what does that say for us, and how does it reflect on our culture as a church? So when you think of, and I didn't use I've really considered, how do you work in a group like the X-Men or the Fantastic Four in a book like this, and try to talk about larger gatherings of superheroes, all trying to do the same thing. So whether it's the Avengers or the Defenders, or the X-Men, or what you really deal with. Okay, so you got all these people with different gifts and different abilities trying to figure out how they best work together, and it doesn't always work out. Sometimes you have great. There was a comic in the 80s called The Champions, and it was supposed to be a new team that was going to come together to fight evil. The writers really struggled to get characters to fit, to be able to work together, and that it doesn't always work. And we saw that in the Marvel cinematic universe with Avengers Civil War. What happens
Mm.
when powerful people collide? So what happens when powerful theologies or powerful beliefs or powerful church behaviors collide? Where do we go with that? And the Reformation was one of those times, right, where the church,
Hmm.
where great thinkers came to heads, with the Catholic Church. And we have Martin Luther and Calvin Zwingli, and others, that Menno Simons, that really had to struggle. And later John Wesley is a part of that, but he's a little bit later after the Reformation, but still trying to come to grips with what happened in the Reformation, because he was still part of the Anglican Church when God kind of called him away from that. So trying to figure out, well, what happens when great thoughts collide and both can't be right? Um, and we have that issue in the church, and we have that issue with Christianity. We have that issue with Scripture. So what do we do with it? And so for many people, we just try to gloss over it. Well, we're all the same. It's all good. It'll all be all right. But it isn't all right. So we really have to struggle with what happens when there are strong disagreements. And I like to use the idea of, God's in control of everything. Uh, and I said, well, is God in control of everything? Because if God's in control of everything, then really you have no responsibility, right? So you have free will, or is everything planned for you? Both can't be true. But yet the two largest churches in the United States, one, the Baptist Church believes that God has preordained everything, the Reformed Church, and then you have the Assemblies of God and other traditions like that say no, you have free will, and it's part of the United Methodist movement as well. We have free will. These things, they're two of the largest groups in the United States and across the globe, and yet they both can't be right, and they want to share the same tenet. and we don't ever want to talk about it. I said, well, at least one of them's wrong, right? They could both be wrong, but they both
Right,
right.
right.
So how do we deal with that? How do we struggle when these heroes come together and collide? And so I think that's part of the fun of kind of working through some of this and getting through pop culture and saying, well, what happens when the modern way of thinking or the current culture in our world clashes with Christianity? What do we do with it? Or at least our understanding of Christianity, right? Because for us to believe that we're following the same identical teachings that Jesus taught the disciples is kind of far fetched, right? Over 2,000 years, those teachings have bent a little bit. And just like everything else, you pass it down. Certain stories get passed down, certain stories get forgotten. And so um, we have to really struggle with, okay, so what happens when the way we see the world as Christians conflicts with the way the world is right in front of us. And so how do we deal with that? What do we say about it? Um, there are those who say, well, you just got to call sin out. Uh, yeah, maybe. Um,
But how do you do it is the
but
important thing. Yeah.
but then go back to scripture and say, well, who did Jesus call sin out for? Wasn't already the church crowd of his day? I mean,
Hmm.
he met with unchurched people, what we would call unchurched people. He wasn't calling out their sin. So
I,
very rarely was he calling out their sin.
yeah, I would say that I don't think it was necessarily that he wasn't calling them out, but it was a different approach. For example, like the woman at the well who wasn't, the in crowd.
Right.
He called her out in a sense, but he did it in a way to give her the opportunity to hear what he was saying, and then she would realize, oh my goodness, I need to change. And then also the woman that he caught in adultery, and he said, "Go and sin no more," to forgive it. But when it comes to the church people, boy, sometimes it was like fire and brimstone, the whip and the temple and sort of stuff. It seems to me that he's harsher on those of us that should know better
Correct.
than those that don't.
Yes. When you look at whether it's Zacchaeus or Matthew, Levi the tax
Mm-hmm.
collector, you look at his interactions with people who maybe didn't know more. Yeah, you begin to realize he did treat them differently. When
Mm-hmm.
the Gospel of Matthew, and he talks about the Pharisees as whitewashed tombstones.
Yeah.
Outside, dead on the inside. And you say, wow, those were the religious leaders of his day. Those were the leaders of his church,
Right.
of the synagogue. And he's saying, yeah, they're not worth following. And yet, if you and I were to talk like that about our church leaders, we would be thrown out of the church.
Mm-hmm.
We can't talk like that. But if we talk like that about unchurched people, the church would pat us on the back.
Yeah.
And so, the money changers in the temple, again, when Jesus overturns those tables, those were religious people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those were the
Yeah.
religious of their day, helping people, under the guise of we're helping people offer sacrifices to God. So that was their whole job in the temple. They were there to do a service for the people. At the same time, they're taking advantage of the people, and that's why Jesus
Mm-hmm.
said about it. But they were the religious people serving the people. And you begin to realize, well, if we came in and started throwing things around in church saying this place is just a den of thieves, we're taking advantage of people, I don't think it would be received very well.
Yeah.
So
Something you mentioned, yeah.
go ahead.
Okay, something you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the Hulk. You talked about how they were concerned. The writers were concerned that he wasn't a good example,
Yeah,
and I find that really it reflects a lot on real life as well. And you think about not just modern times, but in biblical times, the examples we have of our, for lack of a better term, our heroes in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. Paul said he thought himself as the chiefest of sinners. He grew up being a very bad example, and then ended up, changing his life. But even, in the Old Testament, there's many examples of the heroes of the faith that were at times really bad examples. And
Right.
I like how that flows over into the comic books as well, as sometimes these heroes aren't perfect, and the Hulk is a good example of that, as to where they have their flaws, and that helps us to, I think, understand how, in real life, we even the best among us are flawed, and what do we do with that? Have you found that as well?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the great things. See, Superman was the example of the perfect man, right? He's
Right.
the Ultraman. So he does everything right. Later, they try to make him less like that, but I mean, for the first 60 years of
Hmm.
his existence, he doesn't do wrong. He always is doing the
Hmm.
right thing. So it really does. Marvel try to bring that humanity into the world of comic books and say, well, yeah, but what if these people aren't always good? In the story of Spider-Man, where when he first gets his powers, he decides to go try to win some money for himself. In the comic books, it doesn't work out really well. I thought they portrayed it well in most of the movies that they did with Spider-Man, showing him, trying to figure out how he could benefit from this, only to find out that when you benefit for when you do something selfishly, there's always a action that's negative that you may not have anticipated. Now, for him, it's very personal. Because it's his uncle that passes away. But what if it hadn't been his uncle? What if it had just been a random person that got shot? Um, it's still a negative consequence because of his selfishness. And so I think that's one of the great things with the anti-hero style that Marvel had. When you look at, one of the things I like about the Fantastic Four is that they're a family. Reed Richards marries Sue Richards, Sue Storm, who's Johnny Storm's sister, and so they have this family. And so you have it's written in the books of how they don't always get along. The four of them sometimes fight and argue because they think differently and they live differently, and how they, even though they're not the same, how do they work things out? Johnny Storm becomes this young hothead who's very self-centered and self-motivated. Ben Grimm is very much, he is the thing, uh, has all the power, but is deformed in his features. The other three maintain their human form, but he's deformed, and so the conflicts that arise from that, people aren't perfect, and um, when you can write that into a story, it really does help. And certainly the Bible's full of imperfect people. Tell people all the time, David was called a man after God's own heart. David was a horrible human being. So
Yeah.
uh, when you look at the things that he did, he was a horrible father, right? His kids were absolute barbarians, killing one another and wanting bad things to happen to one another. Not good. He has an affair with a woman who's already married. She gets pregnant. Because of that, the baby is then born, is stillborn, so that baby dies, so she suffers. David has that woman's husband killed on a battlefront, um, and then he cries out to God, "Oh God, forgive me." you and then you begin to look and say, "Yeah, but you're not a good person." So
Hmm.
how did this young kid who slayed a giant become such a bad adult, right? And so we have a lot of those stories. Gideon, is a judge in the book of Judges, not necessarily a great human being, right? Just you look at him and say, I don't know, just not a great person. And so there are a lot of stories like that that we get from our. Solomon becomes the wisest king in the history of the Jewish people, and yet you look at his life, he's not a good human being either. And so, the first king is Saul. He's not a good human being. And so you just keep going back and say, where are all these good people? What happens to them? Um, But when you read comics, you realize that there are all of these superheroes who have stories, who have lives, who have had things happen to them that shape their lives, just like you and I do. And we're not always good, and we're not perfect, and we don't always say the right thing. We don't always do the right thing, and we don't always act when we should. And sometimes we're selfish, and sometimes we use our power for our own good. And all of these things are portrayed in the comics, and we can find characters that we identify with and say, yeah, that's kind of me. I'm kind of like that. So early on in my life, I identified with the Hulk. He was my favorite hero growing up because I had so much inner anger that I couldn't let out, and I knew I couldn't let it out because you grow up in church, and being angry is a sin, and you can't show it. But what happened was that you end up having those moments where you can't control that temper because you bottled it, you pressurized it so much that it explodes, and then you hurt people from it. And so, having to deal with things like that, as I got older, uh, I really fell in love with Captain America and the character that he has, and that's the first why he's the first chapter in the book. Trying to understand, for us, for you and me, growing up in church, where so much of our identity as Christians is wrapped up in nationalism, right? God, country, God and country. It's like you love God, you love people, and you love your country, and it's kind of how we grew up. But that's not the story of the New Testament, and that's when you read Captain America, that's his story, right? Captain America is many people don't know the story of Captain America. He's a religious person. He is a Catholic in the comics, and a practicing Catholic, not just a Catholic by name. And this is why kind of in the first movie you hear him say, "Hey, watch your language," right? Because that was his culture. He was straight laced. He was trying to be a good human being, but didn't have the power to be a good human being. Um, he had the power to be a decent human being, but he didn't have the power to affect the world like he wanted to have. He wanted to make
Right.
it right. So beginning to understand you know how he managed himself. So no matter what power he had, he was always looking out for somebody else and how what he did affected others. And I just thought that was really interesting. But when you mix that with nationalism, it takes on a different approach, right? Do you always trust the government? Do you always
Mm.
trust what leaders, whether it's federal government, state government, local government, church government, do you always trust what your leaders say? And if you push back on that, there will be a price to pay.
Right.
Just there's always a price to pay when you push back on leadership.
And
Whatever,
yeah,
right?
and you bringing that up reminds me. I was really uh, interested in the concept that during Marvel's the MCU version of Civil War, it was Captain America was the one that sided against the government,
Yeah,
and it was Iron Man that wanted to fall in line.
right.
And so it was almost a sort of growth for him, as you're saying. Do you always trust the government? Do you always toe the line? And when do you start to question things? And how do you handle that?
Yeah,
Yeah, so I've found that as a part of his character arc, a growth period for him.
absolutely. And I think that's what happens with all of us when we realize that not everybody who's put in charge, no matter how good their intentions
Hmm.
are always right. Matter of fact, they're
They're
never
not all Hydra, but they're not always right either.
all Hydra, but they're not always working against you. But that doesn't. I mean, Iron Man didn't want to side with Hydra, but he
Right.
also he also thought that there needed more restrictions. And Captain America said, "I really think freedom matters more." And
Hmm.
that's an interesting thought, right?
Yeah,
So how much of your liberty are you willing to give up? And
for security. Yeah.
so what does that mean for us as Christians? How much of your Christian liberty are you willing to give up? Because if you read Paul says that we were set free from the law. You, know, you have freedom. He who the Son set free is free indeed. So how much of that spiritual freedom are you willing to give up to fit in?
Mm.
It becomes a challenge for us, right? Everybody's going to answer that a little differently. And I don't want to have civil war within the church, but there are splits that happen because people can't come to agreements on things when they have those kind of disagreements with leadership.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to me. From the Methodist background, you think of the John Wesley quote that's always attributed to him. And I don't know if it was actually him that spoke it or somebody, somebody else, and he took the idea. But in the essentials, unity, and non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. So, in other words, our church, for example, we're very involved locally in ecumenical activities with other congregations. We have different buildings we meet in on Sunday mornings. We do our order of worship differently. But when it comes down to the essentials, we pretty much agree on it. So we can work together to do community activities and stuff like that. And so that's almost a drawing the line sort of question, is where do you draw that line? But you have to set boundaries and say these are the essentials that we agree on, and then on the other things, you do your own thing, we'll do our own thing, and we'll agree to disagree and just live and let live, sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and in the MCU universe, they couldn't agree to disagree.
Right.
You will agree with me, or we'll beat you into submission.
Right.
And that has happened in the church as well.
Yeah. Which brings to mind, you were mentioning some of the superhero teams like the X-Men
Yeah.
and the Fantastic Four, and you seem to have some insights on those as well. Your book here just focused on several superheroes that aren't typically considered parts of a group. I mean, obviously Captain America, Iron Man, they're part of the Avengers. But for the most part, you focused on how they were superheroes as individuals and not part of a group. If you were going to do a sequel to your book, I know the DC's already been done. That was my first idea. It's like, are you going to do a DC thing? But there are books out there, other books on the DC superheroes and the spirituality of them. Would you consider doing a sequel maybe that focuses on the superhero teams?
I've thought of that. My first thought was to do one Jesus versus supervillains,
Oh.
and really talk about what makes evil evil. Because especially in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there have been really horrible villains, right? I mean, when you look,
Mhm.
they weren't, you know, they, they didn't they didn't really challenge anything. I thought Thanos was a great villain for the Avengers to face, not only because he had power, but because he thought that everything he did was good.
Mm.
Um, so he's the hero of his own story. Uh, Everybody else saw him as a villain. Well, not everybody, but all
Mhm.
heroes of the Marvel universe saw him as a villain, but he and his followers saw him as a champion of righting the wrongs that had been done throughout history. And so it becomes an interesting thing. So to talk about how villains, how we label villains and how these villains think, and what makes evil, so what makes evil bad for the world, and could we know good if there wasn't evil? I mean, there's all kinds of things that we can get into, and so that I really consider doing that one. But I would love to do. I would love to figure out a way to work out the super teams and try to figure some of those out. Uh, and how to write about that, because I think it's fascinating. The whole X-Men thing was really written to talk about discrimination in our culture, right? And so if you're not watching X-Men '97 on Disney Plus, you're missing
Mm.
it. It's a fantastic. Uh, it's a fantastic series. I'm really enjoying it. Uh, but they really have to struggle with what it's like to be accepted in a culture. What does that mean? So what's it like when you're different, and when there's a struggle to fit in, and the other, there's it's always the other. So if you're a mutant, humans are the other, and if you're human, mutants are the other. And where do they how do they match up? And so it's really interesting to kind of work through some of that. And I would love to be able to write about that. So maybe I'll get that on on the back burner as well, and see if we can work something out. But if you haven't read this book, it is available still on Amazon. It's available in the paperback, or it's available on Kindle. So you can pick those up on Amazon. They're relatively inexpensive, so it's a good read. And if you buy one, or you borrow one off of Kindle, leave me a review. Let me know what you think. love to talk to people about it because for me, I get excited to talk about pop culture. So
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a link in the description below for those of you that are watching to the Amazon link where you can buy it. Definitely check it out. It's a great book. But before we go, we want to wrap things up here. But talk just to wrap things up. You talk about the question of evil, and I think that's one of the things that is really interesting to a lot of people about villains and anti-heroes, which are they're kind of like the balance between the villain and the hero, is to see that we're not all perfect, as we were discussing a little earlier. We all have our flaws, even the best among us, and the anti-hero aspect of that about where do you draw that line and where is the evil? Is it truly evil, or is it a matter of perspective?
right.
And so I find that interesting. So if you ever do a sequel, follow-up book on Jesus versus supervillains, I'm sure you'll tackle that question in that.
I will.
Yeah. But
So
anyway, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up today. Thank you guys for watching. This is Darin Simms, also, again, the author of this book, Jesus versus Superheroes. It's available on Amazon.com, and there's a link in the description below. Definitely check it out. I love this book, and I am looking forward to reading more. And of course, we do have this channel that I ask you to hit the like button if you enjoyed this program. You can comment down below, ask your questions for Darin, and we can answer some of those in the comments section, or the comment section down below. And we'll have him back on again later to have another conversation and follow up, answering some of your questions as well. But we do have other shows on this channel. There's reaction reviews where I review movie trailers. There's the Light Side Music reviews where we do the same thing except it's for music. We've got our light side conversations, which is what we're doing right now. And then on Sunday afternoons at 2 p.m., we do a live stream where I review food. We call that our Muck Club, which is short for mukbang. And if you're not familiar, that's a Japanese word, Americanized version of it, which means eating food in public, basically, on video. So anyway, check those out, and if you like them, let us know what you like and dislike about the channel. And if you really like it, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications so you know when we go live. And Darin, anything you have coming up soon you want to promote on here real quick?
I don't have anything going on right now, but we do Bible study at my house on Tuesday nights. So if you're in the Central Ohio area and you would like to join a Bible study, drop me a note. I'll get you the information.
Okay, what's your email or contact information?
Yep, you can get me at Mr. Darin at hotmail.com. That's MRDARIN, Mr. Darin at hotmail.com.
Still got your old Hotmail address, huh?
Yes, I do. I use it all the time.
That's great. It's good for consistency.
You know that.
All right. Once again, Jesus versus Superheroes, a challenge of ideas. Get it on Amazon and leave a review after you read it. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Darin, for being with us tonight. And God bless you. Good luck with your ministry and whatever endeavors the Lord leads you into.
All right.
And thank you very much.
Be blessed. Thank you.
All right. All right. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time once again on the Light Side Conversations. Bye, everybody.